Hello and welcome. I think that in the UK, we're struggling. We're struggling because we're having to carry a burden. And that burden is one of moral injury, or perhaps more correctly, moral distress. What do I mean by moral distress? Well, before I talk about that, let's look back a little bit to the before times and listen to, in this instance, Angela Rayner.
Well, the government failed the women who were born in the 1950s. They stole their pension, that contract, that agreement that they thought they had, and then accelerated it so that those women didn't have the chance to prepare for that. We said we'll right that injustice, and within the 5 years of the Labour government, we will compensate them for the money that they've lost. This is their money that they've had stolen off them, and it's completely unacceptable. And any government should act responsibly to these women who have looked after their children through that period. They're often looking after elderly relatives now, and they're a part of our society that have felt really unjust by the way they've been treated, and it's absolutely right that we deal with this issue.
Makes you feel all warm and fuzzy, doesn't it? And here is the then man in the shadows. Perhaps he still is in the shadows. The man in waiting, Keir Starmer himself.
We're going to roll up our sleeves, fix the problems and improve our country. We can't keep expecting the British people to just suck it up.
Couldn't agree more, Keir. Oh, and here's more recent news about Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor.
Now, Rachel Reeves is in a bit of a pickle over all this, and to prove that point, I just want to show you something courtesy of the Guido Fawkes news website. Here we have a before and after. What does this show you? Well, this is from the Chancellor's own LinkedIn, who apparently, when she's not going to war with pensioners and farmers who are pensioners, she has some time to adjust her own LinkedIn profile. Maybe she's looking for a new job soon. Here we have at the top, before, economist at the Bank of Scotland, very impressive. And then after, retail banking in Halifax. Well, that's not exactly the same thing, is it? Something has happened here. She's changed this whilst at the Treasury. You might ask, if I did that, if I at my job suddenly admitted that the job I claim to have in order to get the role I'm currently in, if I hadn't done that at all, and I changed it about 3 or 4 years afterwards, would I get in trouble?
Things do seem to have turned around since before Keir was Prime Minister, Angela was Deputy Prime Minister, and Rachel was Chancellor. However, the farmers, thank goodness, remain ever supportive.
We had a riot police van turn up, that's still beside us here, and around 8 or so police officers came. As I say, they blocked those gates, and some of those tractors that were inside while the Prime Minister was in there, they are just starting to come out now, just finally being allowed out. Now, while that was happening, the Prime Minister was quickly whisked away in his Land Rover, and they were taken away by another exit. We understand not the exit that the Prime Minister had planned to leave from. You can see some of the signs here, those farmers who've coordinated this action over the last 12 hours or so.
Oh, perhaps then we should talk about moral injury. We'll begin here. The Lancet, Psychiatry. Moral injury, the effect on mental health and implications for treatment. Moral injury is understood to be the strong cognitive and emotional response that can occur following events that violate a person's moral or ethical code. Potentially morally injurious events include a person's own or other people's acts of omission or commission, or betrayal by a trusted person in a high-stakes situation. I would also add, by a person in a high position of authority and influence. Then let's look here. Durham University International Centre for Moral Injury. I've picked on this because I think it's quite good and encompasses things in a succinct but quite powerful way. What is moral injury? Moral injury refers to the experience of sustained and enduring negative moral emotions, those emotions that we feel when our moral code or sense of right and wrong, good and bad, has been damaged, strained, snapped, challenged, diminished, destroyed even. Guilt, shame, contempt and anger, that results from the betrayal, violation or suppression of deeply held or shared moral values. And again, we can all be a little bit different, but by and large, most people are the same. Those moral values, the things that we would want to protect, that we hold dear, are so important to us. And those values, of course, are connected to beliefs. We have a belief about what is important. We value that thing that we believe is morally important, and we would do whatever we could to protect it and to defend it. It is distinct from post-traumatic stress disorder, which entails the body and mind's adaptation to situations of extreme fear and stress. Moral injury involves a profound sense of broken trust in ourselves, our leaders, governments and institutions to act in just and morally good ways. I should mention that PTSD and moral injury can have an overlap, as you may already have suspected or know. But it's not to say that we would have PTSD when moral injury is there every time. And I mentioned moral distress earlier on. Moral distress is a lesser version of moral injury. I wanted to highlight this article. That powerlessness you feel is called moral distress. Powerlessness. That's an important word to bear in mind, in my opinion. It's also important to note that in terms of this article, it was authored by guest writer Michelle DeMarco, who is an award-winning writer and published author in the fields of psychology, trauma, health and spirituality. She is a professionally trained therapist, clinical ethicist and researcher, specialising in moral injury and resilience. I wanted to focus on a couple of examples in this article. They're referencing the lockdowns and the effect that they had on some people. Families needing the security of a home, but because of unemployment or financial issues no longer being able to afford it. People desperate to spend time with elderly or solitary family members, or those who are sick or dying, but being unable to because of health dangers. Individuals whose values and beliefs are in conflict with state and federal safety guidelines, or lack thereof. Now, whatever you thought about the guidelines in terms of lockdowns, I think it's fair to say that there was a point where they seemed to be a little draconian for many people. Specifically here, what I'm focusing on is this idea, this concept, this reality of moral distress. And moral distress isn't, of course, just about lockdowns, but think about it. During that time, there was a sense of powerlessness. So not only was that going on, not only were people in the UK at least particularly disappointed, that's putting it mildly, with the Tories, then there was an element of hope, potentially. Then there was this idea that maybe, even although many of us thought, our intuition is telling us something different, maybe Labour will be a breath of fresh air. And so we had that little flame, that ember of hope. And since then, I think what we've seen is more of a feeling of powerlessness. And it's heaped upon 2 or 3 years ago when there was so-called free-floating anxiety and the uncertainty and fear and chaos that the lockdowns brought. And so what we have is it's not the same as moral injury, and it isn't the same as the moral distress that, say, a nurse may feel, or someone in the military, or in the police, and so on. It's not as acute as that, but I think it's chronic. I think it's been going on for a while. And Labour, rather than being the party who just alleviated a lot of that stuff, have made it worse, in my opinion. They have increased that sense of, to use that word again, powerlessness, of things being done to, of not being listened to, of feeling anxious because we don't know what's going to happen next, and we don't really believe the explanations that were being given for the decisions that are being made. And that disbelief has been warranted in many cases, but the issue there is that you then begin to believe nothing that you're told. And so there's a hell of a lot of work that needs to be done by all politicians, and in particular, Labour. From this article, in fact, the evidence suggests that people in the past devoted significant time and scarce resources to caring for those in need. Scouring the archaeological literature, Tilley and others have turned up evidence that caring for the weak and sick is behaviour that goes back as far as Neanderthals. I take these cases for granted now, Tilley says. From the very earliest times, we can see evidence that people who were unable to function were helped, looked after, and given what care was available. Those so-called primitive societies, it would seem, took very good care of the older people, the infirm, and the vulnerable. What the hell are we doing right now? Who are we looking after in this country? So, good people in Labour, please do something. Let's get back on track. Let's get this country back on track. The track of morality, morals, ethics, doing good and not bad, doing right and not wrong.
In the leafy Norfolk town of Downham Market, once True Blue, now Labour, you don't have to look far to find buyer's remorse.
Must be the most unpopular Prime Minister ever.
What do you think?
I think they're rubbish.
Well, they sort of say one thing and then when they get in power, they do another. But the fact that this thing is Spencer's that came up, free gifts and all that.
So far, not particularly impressed with Keir Starmer.
So far, no. I mean, it could change, you never know. But then, the moon could move out of orbit.
Well, it's unlikely that the moon will move out of orbit, but an equivalent would be if the moon told us it was going to move out of orbit, then it didn't. It just lied, made us a promise. And then we realised that the moon's got a dark side. And it would seem that some of our leaders in this government also have a dark side as well.